Okay, so today we are talking about the chemistry in cells. That is your topic, and your goal is I can explain the important role of organic chemistry in cells. So we know that if something is organic, it means it has carbon. So we're going to talk about how that affects us and basically makes us alive. So organic compounds, just a little review, it used to be thought that only living things could synthesize carbon compounds found in cells. But German chemists in the 1800s learned how to do this in the lab, showing that quote unquote organic compounds can be created by non-organic means. Today, organic compounds is basically anything with a carbon except there's just a couple exceptions such as carbon dioxide and diamonds. So there are four groups of organic compounds, and we are going to go through each of these four and talk about what it's made up of. And yes, they are all made up of carbons and other things. Their function in our body, and some examples of each. So there's carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So carbohydrates. For the function, which the function is what will be used for your definition on your test. So you need to know that carbohydrates are the main source of energy and that plants and some animals use it for structural purposes. So they are composed of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, and the ratio is for every one carbon, you have two hydrogens and one oxygen. Okay, so examples, there are three listed right here. You only need to pick one. I have glucose underlined because I feel like that's probably the one you're most familiar with. I am going to go through the different examples and just talk about them, but you only need to write down one example. So glucose is plant produced during photosynthesis. Galactose is found in milk and dairy items, and fructose is sugar in many fruits. So here is what glucose looks like. So it has one of those rings that we briefly mentioned, and it has all the carbons and oxygens in it as well. Okay, here's what fructose looks like. So you notice they are very similar, but this is only a 5-sided ring, whereas this is an 8-sided ring. Okay, so you also have disaccharides. So you have your monosaccharides, which you notice is just one ring, and then you have your disaccharides, which have two rings, which is why it's di. An example of that is maltose. And then there's also polysaccharides, which are big chains, which has more than one ring. And these are some more examples that you may be familiar with, like glycogen, which is stored energy, starch, which is plant stored energy, and cellulose, which is found in cell walls. Okay, so that's carbohydrates. Now we're going to talk about lipids. So they have a large group, they're made up of large groups of organic compounds. You notice that's a lot of carbons. So they have really long chains. Some of them have rings, some of them don't. So it's mostly made up of carbon and hydrogen, and there may be a couple oxygens here and there. So not nearly as many oxygen as found in carbohydrates. So the function for lipids is it stores energy for long term and is a waterproof covering. So there are four main categories of lipids, and I do want you to write all four down. And that's fats, oils, waxes, and steroids. So here's an example of fat. So you have all these carbons and all these hydrogens and one little or two little oxygens right here on the end, but not very many of them. So we know here's some more examples of lipids. So there's saturated and unsaturated. The only thing that makes these different is this little double bond right there in the middle of the chain. If it has a double bond, it is unsaturated. If it does not have that double bond, it is just saturated. Okay, so saturated versus unsaturated. Saturated means all the carbon bonds are taken. They're all single bonds. They are solid at room temperature and are typically unhealthy for you. Unsaturated means there's one double bond. They are liquid at room temperature and they are better for you. So if it is a fat that is a solid at room temperature, it tends to be more unhealthy than if it's a liquid at room temperature, it is healthier for you. Not saying if it's liquid, it's healthy, it's just healthier for you. But it's crazy how that one little double bond changes what phase it's at in room temperature, and it changes how your body takes it and how it's healthy for you or not healthy for you. So here's another example. Unsaturated double bond, saturated has a single bond. So here is a picture. We have walnut oil, olive oil, two different types, butter, margarine, some other oil, looks like lard. So if it's a solid, it is saturated. If it is a liquid, it is unsaturated. Alright, so that brings us to proteins. Proteins is a vocab. So function. Now proteins, before we get to the function, it contains your carbons and hydrogens, and then just like everything else, there's some oxygen. But what makes proteins a little bit different is it can also contain nitrogen. So the function for proteins gives the rate of cell processes, cellular structures, control substances in and out of cells, and fight diseases. So proteins are pretty important. Okay, any large group of nitrogen-containing organic compounds that are essential part of cell consists of polymers of amino acids essential to the diet of animals for growth and for repair of tissues. It can be obtained from meat and eggs and milk and legumes, a diet high in protein. So if you are vegetarian, which means you don't eat any meat or anything from any animals, the only thing that you can get that has protein is the legumes, which is, I think, certain like beans and stuff like that. So you need to make sure if you are not eating anything else full of protein that you do eat that protein, because like we just talked about, it's basically like keeping you alive. So it is vital for your health. So examples of protein, your hemoglobin in your blood, collagen, enzymes, and insulin. Okay, protein and amino acid formation. We're just going to kind of briefly talk about this, but you don't need to type any of this out. So proteins are made up of monomers of amino acids held together by peptide bonds. So three parts of an amino acid. You have your amino group, you have your carboxyl group, so which is the carbon, and then your R group. So you have something hanging off of the middle. Carbons is your R group. You have your nitrogen group, which is the amino group, and then your carboxylic group, which is your oxygens. Okay, so that brings us to nucleic acids. So you need to know nucleic acids. The function is it carries the genetic material and carries codes to make proteins. Nucleotides. There are three parts to nucleotides: the phosphate, deoxyribose sugar, and a nitrogen base. Nucleic acid, any variation of macromolecules composed of nucleotide chains that are vital constituents of living cells. Well, here's an example of it right here, DNA, but that also includes RNA. So macromolecules, they contain H, N, C, O, and P. So with proteins, we know proteins contain all of this. So the one difference between proteins and nucleic acids is nucleic acids also has phosphorus or P. There are two examples of nucleic acids, RNA and DNA. RNA is ribose nucleic acids, DNA is deoxyribose nucleic acids. So function of DNA carries the codes to make proteins, carries genetic codes. We already talked about the function of nucleic acids as a whole. I'm just splitting up what DNA and what RNA does. You do not have to write these down. That's why it's not underlined. Okay, and then RNA is to make, the function of RNA is to make proteins from the code DNA carries. All right, so for this section, you'll notice there's not a practice page, as because I know this is a lot of notes for you to take down. You will need to know this information for your test, so it is very important that you got everything down that was underlined or in red. So if you need to watch this video again, pause it to get the notes you need so you can use it on your test. You're more than welcome to. And if you have any questions, or if you're interested and want to dig a little bit deeper in the chemistry of cells, let me know and I'll be happy to help.